Well, Brandon Taylor, welcome to our bookshelf from apartment 3C. 3C Reads.
Well, thank you for having me. It's so funny. 3C, I'm in an apartment that's 10C, so maybe we're just,
Oh, we
you
are
know,
cosmically connected.
yes.
I love that. I love all these stories so much. I revisited them the last couple days because I read this initially a few months ago when we selected the book for the book club, and it was so incredible to return to it because I had highlighted and marked all these quotes that I loved, and then I highlighted and marked new things that I hadn't marked the first time, the second time through, and I thought, man, I could highlight the whole book.
Oh, well, that makes me so happy. That's also how I am as a reader. I'm like a real rereader almost,
Yeah.
and the books that mean the most to me, I feel like are those books that when I read them back through the second time, I'm always like noticing something something new. So
Yeah.
it's very gratifying that I've written something that somebody can find new things in on a second pass.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure it will be more and more things on every pass. Um, how do you, where does something like this start for you? I know you also wrote a novel, and then you have this collection of short stories. Do you have do you have a particular process of how you start from an idea, that sort of turns into this? Are you like collecting sentences as you think of them, or, do you have a particular process to that?
Yeah, well, my process is, not very interesting. The stories in Filthy Animals, they started, the Lionel Charles Sophie stories, the stories that are sort of at the heart of the book with the recurring characters. I literally thought, I want to write a story about a potluck where someone goes after sort of not socializing for a very long time and then meets someone who changes his life and what would that be like? And so I started from a real kind of basic situation. And then I just sort of, as I went, I would think, well, now I want to write about dance, or now I want to write
Mm.
about monogamy, but like make it complicated, not just like boring, but like how are two people together? Like, how does that work? How do relationships work? And I feel like my process is mostly just not writing for a really long time and then getting a really clear image in my head and just having a lot of questions about it, pursuing it,
Oh,
and
wow.
writing story after story. And it often is the case that one image or scene informs the next image or scene. And so I'm kind of going, it's like driving on a long road on a foggy night. You can only ever see what's just in front of you, and you never know what's going to emerge
I
as you
love
go.
that. That's amazing. Did you ever consider writing a novel about Lionel and Charles and Sophie?
I did very, very early. I thought, maybe because I had this agent who was wanting me to write a novel.
Hmm.
And so I thought maybe I'll do that. But after I wrote the first story, I was like, no, I really like writing stories. I think that's what this wants to be. And so I wrote it as stories, and but then like 4 months later, I wrote my novel, so the stories in this
Mm.
book predate the novel.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
and so I think in some ways that the novel only happened because I had failed to write the Lionel Charles Sophie stories as a novel. And I was like, well, that didn't work. Those are definitely stories. Maybe I'll try again.
I feel like you're being way too humble. I mean, I, I'm not an expert, so I don't have the right words to articulate this in like a highfalutin way, but it's like I can tell there's such a precision with your words. You're incredibly precise in the way that you express emotions. You articulate things that seem inarticulatable, and yet somehow you find a way to put words together in a way that a feeling is given. For our watchers, I just know like when you read this, you're going to be wowed, and he's being very humble.
Well, what you say is like very gratifying to me as a writer, because I feel like the reason that I write very often is because I often say that I was raised by wolves. I grew up in a very difficult, very uncommunicative family. And I've always wondered, like, how do people know how to be in relationships? Like I watch movies and I read books, and the characters just kind of like know how to be in love, or like they know how to have that sort of witty banter. And as a writer, I'm so obsessed with like yeah, but like, how do they know? And like,
Yeah.
what are those things that hold people together? And so as a writer, I'm always trying to find really particular language for it. And I always feel like even if I can't find the exact correct word for, how two people know how to be together, I can at least capture that moment when two characters realize like, oh, here's a person who is like me and
Mm.
I want to know them. And so even if I can't find the exact words, I can at least capture that moment of realization of like recognizing something in someone else as something like you. And that is like what I'm obsessed with. And I always thought like other people knew all this stuff and that it wouldn't be interesting to them, but what I have found is people are like, no, I didn't know that anyone else was confused by this
Yes.
either.
Yes. I mean, I really responded to that. It was interesting you saying about that you grew up in a family where there was not a lot of communication, because I did notice one of my notes was that there seemed to be always a character, at least one character in every relationship that you wrote that didn't communicate. We were let in a little bit of like what their process was, as a reader, but whoever was in the partnership with them would have no sense of the lack of communication. And I felt like a very intentionally designed into these stories. And it sounds like that kind of came from some personal experience.
Yeah, I feel like I'm always the one who sees too much and like yet doesn't know how to like articulate that to people. Even in my friendships, like I can see that my friends are making certain moves or they're feeling things, but they don't know how to express it, or maybe they're not aware that they're doing it.
Mm.
And I find it really difficult to look away. And so one of the central tensions of most of my relationships and my friendships and stuff like that is like asking people the question they least want to hear.
It's
um,
important to have that person in your life, though. I mean, it's powerful because it creates I don't know. It opens up the possibility for things to change. Without the challenge or the friction of a question like that, nothing changes, right?
it's true, it's true. And for me, like I have no sense of like what like that it's going to be a kind of deeply disconcerting question. And so I'll just like ask these questions very blithely. And my friends will go silent on the phone and they'll be like, you could just pretend that you don't see this, And I'll be like, that's great. We can pretend. I'm fine. We can just I was not trying to like ask a very profound question. And so my way of saving my friendships, I guess, in some ways, is just like doing that to my character so I don't do it to my friends.
Right. You're like, I'll just get this all out of my system now, and
Yes.
and I'll spare my friends. If someone were to, someone who hadn't read
Mm.
this collection of short stories, wanted to know what this was about, how would you describe this collection?
Right. So I would say that it's a book of stories, but it has like a plot. And I would say that the plot is that the first story opens on the night of a potluck where a young man, Lionel, who has just gotten out of a hospital, he goes because, he wants to socialize for the first time in a long time. And there he meets a dancer. His name is Charles, and he gets involved with Charles and then Charles's girlfriend Sophie, and they spend 3 days in Madison, Wisconsin, kind of orbiting each other and testing each other and figuring out like, sort of like sniff like dogs in a park sniffing each other. And I would say that every other story in the book then is what I call interstitial stories, and they're stories about people who are experiencing different kinds of loneliness and heartache
Mm.
and trying to figure out like who they are and what they want in the world. And I would say that the book as a whole kind of orbits these themes of isolation and alienation. And for as sad as it is, I think that it's also a very hopeful book because it ultimately is about getting up the courage to reach out and make connections even if you're afraid to. And so
Yes,
that to me is kind of what it's all about.
absolutely. I couldn't have put it better, obviously, since you wrote it. But it's interesting, also just thinking about the loneliness of it all, because I felt like reading this, especially the second time through, I was really moved by the hopefulness of your loneliness that you
Mm.
express, because it made me realize that loneliness serves this purpose in our lives, which is that it gives us the engine or like the agency to step outside ourselves to connect. And so I started to feel like a yearning that wouldn't be there if there hadn't been the loneliness. And then that yearning led to action, which led to doing things that opened up their lives in a new way. It didn't mean that every decision was good or every decision was bad. It could be either one, or it could be completely benign. But the fact that it actually like pushed us to move, to act, to be. And I was like, oh, I never really thought about the fact that loneliness serves such a deep purpose in all of our lives.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think that people consider loneliness to be a rather passive state of being,
Mm,
and but often it's true that loneliness causes us to think very deeply about who we are and what matters to us. And I think what each of the stories in the book kind of crystallizes around is a moment when a character who is lonely realizes that they're lonely.
mm,
And when they realize, like, oh, all of this stuff that I've been feeling, it's because I am alone and I am lonely. And I wish I were the kind of person who could make a connection. And I think that one thing that the stories then do is they sort of urge the character along this path of making choices. Some of the characters do manage to reach out to disastrous and sometimes really beautiful
sure.
consequences,
Yes.
but some of the characters realize, like, oh, I don't know that I can reach out, and instead I'm going to look really deep into myself, and I'm going to try to figure out like what I really want. And so sometimes the characters reach out not to another person, but to another version of themselves, which I think
Mm,
is another thing that loneliness can do for us. But I think, the book tries to dramatize the moment when a person realizes that they are lonely, and
mm.
then what do you do about it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really beautiful. I also feel like that is all the way that that's all expressed feels so visual and cinematic and active. Do you have visual references along the way? Like, do you have photos that you put up, or
Mm,
movies that you feel like have influenced you, or art that you feel like has influenced you?
yeah, totally. I mean, so I grew up on a farm in Alabama, and a mostly like illiterate family. But
Mm.
one thing that I would do when I was very young is one of my aunts got me a subscription to Vogue. And so when Vogue would come, I would cut out the editorials and the sort of fashion campaigns, and I would sort of make these paper dolls and sort of imagine, like, who are these people. And so, like, very early on, my storytelling vocabulary like fused with this sort of visual imagination. And another thing that happened is that very early on, after realizing that I was gay, I wanted gay stories, but there were very few gay books available to me. So I would like stream in the very early internet, stream and torrent like gay movies that were on YouTube and online. And so much of my early storytelling vocabulary comes out of like made for TV French movies and Vogue editorial catalog.
That's amazing. I mean,
um,
it's so great. It's funny because I did think I was like, this does feel very almost like French New Wave.
mhm.
You know what I mean? Like I feel like that French New Wave cinema, it like lives in your writing in some way. So it
Yes.
doesn't surprise me.
Oh, it's totally. I mean, and my first novel recently came out in France, and all of the Parisian, journalists were like, "Wow, this feels so familiar." And I'm like, "Yes, it's because I that was one of my first narrative languages was, gay, sad, depressing French cinema." And so when I write, I feel like I'm trying to capture how those early films and images made me feel. There's something so beautifully melancholic about those movies, and also those editorial catalog, like the sort of fashion editorials in Vogue. There was a time when they were kind of an apex narrative form in and of themselves, and they were
Yeah.
so arresting and visually interesting. And so I'm always trying to capture in some way like how those early images made me feel. And there's something so elusive to them, something kind of mysterious about them. They don't explain anything. And so you're having to sort of do the work of
Mm.
teasing out the subtext and the nuances of narrative. And so I think definitely the kind of subtextual, subterranean melancholy of the stories comes from, you know, all of that stuff.
That's amazing. It's not at all what I expected in terms of
Mm,
the vogue of it all, but I see what you're saying, and it makes me feel like we've really kind of lost that a little bit in magazines. You know, it's like I actually when I was younger, a lot of my work when I was acting, I was pulling images from Vogue and InStyle and Better Homes and Gardens. I would go and I'd buy every magazine I could find and cut out the images that just felt right for that character, and then I would just sort of work from that collage, in terms of like finding
mm.
what they wore and how they moved. And so, but I feel like less and less I'm able to do that because it doesn't feel like it's as loaded as what you're saying it was, when you were looking at those Vogues when you were younger.
Oh, totally. I mean, I used to, for the very earliest bad stories I would write, I would sort of cull together their wardrobe by looking at these and these images. And, you know, I feel like you used to be able to flip open a magazine and it would sort of tell you something about, you know, who a sort of character in that editorial was supposed to be. And I think that with the sort of atomization of culture, we've lost these kind of like master reference points in some way. And there's something really
Mhm.
beautiful about that because now everybody is in control of the visual vocabulary. But it is true that things feel less, it's like harder to do somehow. It's harder to kind of disappear into the mystery of like a really good fashion editorial because it's like people aren't playing characters anymore. They're playing themselves in a really nice dress.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting. It really has kind of evolved to being a little bit of a different medium than it once was,
Mm.
which is kind of fascinating. Did you have personal connections to the dance world? There's so much. I mean, it's yeah, clearly like a beautiful metaphor in terms of, especially the story about Charles, when you realize how painful dancing is for so many people and how hard on people it is, and yet there's that similar to your relationships that you show. It's like there's a whole lot of pain mixed with a whole lot of love of something, and so I can feel that metaphor working. But it seems like you have such an intimate knowledge of that world. Is that just research, or were you connected to the dance world?
I always wanted to be, and when I was very young, I wanted to dance, and my mom told me no. She was like, "You
No.
can play football instead," and I like did not want to play football. But I always, it sort of was a thing that lived in my mind, and when it came time to write, I was like, I really want to write about dance. Like I've always wanted to, but I kind of don't know enough about it. And I was sort of grappling with that. And then I watched this. So every year around this time, actually, there's World Ballet Day, and they sort of take these cameras into sort of all the world's major ballet companies and they
Mm,
film them, they do interviews, they do breakdowns of choreography, and they film a morning class. And I saw one of these videos and I was like, oh, I know what this is. This is practice.
mm.
And even though I didn't grow up dancing, I grew up, all of my cousins and my brother like played football. They all played sports. And one of my cousins was like, you know, he was sort of drafted to a D1 university, played for the University of Alabama.
Wow.
He tried out for the NFL. He had a really great, you know, pro camp, and then he like got injured and couldn't do it anymore. And I was like, and this cousin, like he had been sort of a top recruit at every level of football. He was like 6 feet tall at 14 or something. And so he was like on track to become like an apex athlete. And he had been that his entire life. And then he gets injured and suddenly he has to find a new life for himself. And I was like, and so watching these ballet
Mm,
dancers, I was like, oh, I know what this is. Like I have not done ballet, but I have like been with my cousins practicing every day of the summer. I've been with them waking up at 5 a.m. to like go and like hone themselves into this terrifying physical weapon, you know, and this absolute dedication to a discipline that will destroy their bodies. And I know what that's like. And so realizing that ballet is so much that, I was like, oh, I know what this is.
yeah.
And also writing is like that as well. You dedicate yourself to like becoming so good at your craft, and then next year there's 7 new debut novels, you know? Like
Yep.
the sort of brutality of it and the sort of discipline and monastic dedication to getting better at your craft. And so I just sort of worked from that. I, of course, did a bunch of research to sort of learn the terms, and I watched a lot of
Sure.
dance to kind of be able to live in it a little more. But yeah, I was just working from a deep familiarity with discipline. And,
Yeah, well, it's interesting because that makes sense. I mean, it's, anything that requires that kind of discipline does really become universally relatable. I think we've all had different moments in our for us, it was marching band in our family, but
mm,
it's like same thing with football, same thing with dance. It is interesting. And it also crosses over into being able to have life skills. It's like we might not use trigonometry from high school, but the football training or the ballet training or the show choir or the marching band or
mm.
whatever, the discipline that you learn in there, I probably, kind of overflows into real life eventually, right?
Oh, totally. I mean, I was a research scientist for like m my entire life, and I don't pipette anymore, but I still sort of the training and how to think and how to be rigorous
Yes.
is something I use every day.
Yeah.
And it shows up in my writing all the
Wait, so
time.
tell me more about this. What was your path that you were going down before writing?
Oh yeah, so when I was like 3 years old, I decided I was going to be a neurosurgeon, and I pursued that very aggressively. And I got to undergrad, I got to university where I studied chemistry, and I did really well in all my pre-med courses, and I was going to go to medical school, and I just like did not like other pre-meds. I was like, I don't
Mm,
know that I can do this for 8 more years being around these kinds of people. They were just very I didn't like it. And I was like, I need a new life path. And so at 22, I was like, I'm gonna switch. And so I switched to study biochemistry. I wanted to find a cure for Alzheimer's. And
wow.
so I went to a PhD program in biochemistry, and I was studying stem cells and stuff like that. And I did that for, most of the 20 teens. And then in
Wow.
2017, I left to go get an MFA in creative writing. But for most of my life,
Wait,
I was,
wait, yeah, that's a big leap.
yeah. Well, so while I was working in a lab, I was like working in a lab doing science experiments, and someone was kind of sabotaging my experiments. They were not being a very good lab mate. And I was getting in trouble for it. And my advisor said, you're going to have to shape up, or I'm going to have to ask you to leave the lab.
Oh,
And I was like, well, I'm not messing up. And I was like, well, that's not fair. And I was like, well, fairness in life. But all along, I had been writing little stories to amuse myself. So I thought, as a backup plan, I will apply to a creative writing program just in
okay.
case I get kicked out. And so one afternoon, I just like mailed some of my stories to the IR Writers Workshop, and spent most of the rest of the year just like trying to get better at science. And then my experiment started working because this person was sort of found to be not very good.
Mm,
And so then right when my experiment started working, I found out that I got accepted to the Iowa Writers Workshop, and I had to make this
wow.
choice between
Yeah,
stay in science or go pursue writing, which I never thought that I would do. I never thought that I would be a writer.
sure.
Um, and so then I had a choice to make. And obviously I chose to leave. And now I'm out writing books, I guess.
That's amazing. It's such an unusual, twisty, turny path to get to creative writing.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's so funny because when I was an undergrad, I was pre-med, and so of course every Tuesday we would watch House in our dorm.
No way.
Yes, we would
Oh
watch it
God.
religiously. We would go and we would watch House every Tuesday or whatever day it came on, and that was our thing. We would do that, and we would talk over the cases, and it was
Oh
like
wow.
a major part of my my
I love
life.
that. I feel like thank God it was a show where they did enough research to sort of get some stuff right. Like I've heard, because I don't know, I'm not a medical person in real life, but I have heard from, people in the medical community. They're like, you know what, you guys got a lot right. You were at least like on target with the ideas.
Oh
Sometimes you
yeah.
over dramatized your like, you know, act out breaks when someone had to have a seizure or whatever. But besides
Yeah.
that,
I mean, we would like race to see who could diagnose it first.
First.
So we're always like racing you guys on the show. And of course the famous "It's Lupus" meme is like one of the great memes
It's
of
never
contemporary.
lupus.
Except
It
some
literally
one
was never there. I guess it was maybe one time in 8 years, but it was like we even got to the. I think that joke started because we got to the point where like, oh man, if I'm the one pitching lupus, I'm going to be wrong because it's never lupus.
you know, lupus is kind of like that. It's kind of everything and nothing as a disease. Like it's kind of
Right.
everything. And but yeah, so like, for a very long time I watched that show every night. And it was like one of the few things that I also watched with my parents when I was like home for breaks from
Oh,
school.
amazing.
And so yeah, it was a sort of big part of my identity as a pre-med student.
Wow. And it's so crazy too, because you're saying you were working with stem cells, and I'm now directing the first 4 episodes of Dr. Death season 2. And so many of these like medical kind of true crime situations center around those early teen years when everybody was obsessed with the stem cells and thought that they were these like miracle cells. More than that, like they were magical or something, and it was like
Yeah.
this race to patent all these things. And it feels like a lot of people died because of stem cell faith. Did they seem to be that miraculous, like when you were studying them in the lab? What was it that made stem cells feel
Mm.
different?
Well, I think it's just that it's this it is kind of magical. I mean, it is this kind of cell that can become almost any kind of tissue depending on the kind of stem cell it is. And in those early teen years, they hadn't yet elucidated all the mechanisms behind it, and it was really difficult to get stem cells, right? So for a
Mm,
while there, they thought the only way to get it was embryonic stem cells, and so it became embroiled in all of these ethical debates. And that was coming right on the heels of the Terry Schiavo case, right? And so it became this wild cultural flashpoint. So the science wasn't there yet,
mm,
and also it had this sort of bigger than life promise that we're going to be able to heal anything with stem cells. And
yep.
and so by the time I come along in like 2013, I'm in a lab. I was studying the regulation of stem cells, so like how they maintain their stem cell state. And I was sort of deep in the molecular biology of it all, and so we were a little far removed from those sort of frontline ethical debates in some ways.
Interesting.
But now, I mean, now the science is better, and I think that the dreams of what stem cells can do have been tempered a little bit. But I think we're on the cusp of like another big thing in
Mm,
stem cell biology, especially with CRISPR, like the ability to like edit these cells. I mean,
crazy,
we are
huh?
right there again, and it's kind of wild.
Yeah. It's just so interesting because it's like there's two sides of me, right? There's sort of
Mm,
the viewer in me that is like reading the articles about it and hearing about, the possibilities and going, wow, this is incredible. And then there's the side of me that's directing a show about a bunch of people who died because of it. I'm just like, oh man, hearing that there's another like wild, wild west of stem cells coming is like very terrifying.
Well, I mean, it is quite terrifying. I mean, when I was studying stem cell biology, right around 2013, 2014, there's this thing called CRISPR that was found.
Yeah.
And at the same time, there's this big revolution in how stem cells are made. And so there was all this science that, like, suddenly you don't need embryonic stem cells anymore. You can turn any cell into a stem cell. And all of these things combined to be kind of wacky because now people were suddenly using genome editing technology on human embryos. And like,
Mm,
that's a big no-no. Like,
yeah.
ethics suddenly got very murky. And now there's I think a few days ago I read an article about organoids, which are these synthetic human organs that are grown in tissue culture or whatever. And they're making organoids of like human brains. And so you're able to sort of take skin, reprogram it to be a stem cell, and then to cause those stem cells to become like neurons, basically. And there was one article that was like, yes, we now have this brain organoid that's able to play Pong. So they have like these neurons in a dish programmed to play computer games. And I was like, it's not a brain, but it's not a brain.
Oh my
Apparently,
God.
someone's brain that you made from their skin. And of course,
Whoa.
this technology isn't to make things that can play Pong. So, like, for example, a person with Alzheimer's disease, you can take a skin sample from them and then make neurons that model the progression of their Alzheimer's to sort of hopefully make therapies or to sort of better understand the disease. But even that is kind of ethically murky because you're making a copy of someone's brain, and like, is that brain them? Is it a human? Who knows? Like,
Yeah, yeah. Like what
so
gives
now
it
we
its
are.
identity? Is it a piece of is it atoms and it's nothing and
Hmm.
it's fine, or is it
And so you can imagine how scary that is in a kind of like post-Roe world. Like it's
yeah.
no, it's all kind of, we are living in science fiction land. And so I just try occasionally I like accidentally stumble back into the science world and I'm like, wow, it's wacky over there. It's
Yeah. Well, you know what what I forget so often is science is just an extension of nature. You know, it's like we
hmm
like to sort of act like science and nature are these two separate things, right? But the truth is everything scientific is us trying to understand nature. We're trying to understand our bodies,
totally.
the planet, organisms, all the stuff that's already here. And medicines are, you know, versions of natural things that we're mimicking, and but all those chemicals are somewhere on this planet or we wouldn't have them, you know. So it is this interesting thing where you can't really draw a line between science and nature, and yet we kind of try to dump them into these two categories as if they have nothing to do with each other.
I agree. And the same with like science and literature. I mean, it's like people forget that like science used to just be a branch of philosophy. Like
Mm,
mathematics used to be a branch of philosophy, natural philosophy, I think is what it used to be called. And some of the earliest scientists were like philosophers. And
hmm.
so much of this stuff for me all comes from the same place, which is a human desire to want to know the world more deeply and more intimately. And, you know, for me, writing a short story and performing a set of scientific experiments, those come from the same parts of my brain. And so I think that a lot of people, because of, I guess, the way American education is structured, perhaps, they
Yeah,
think like, oh, you're either science or you're this. And I'm like, well, actually, we should be taught that like these are just methods of discernment and
yeah,
they're all really important and we should be practicing discernment
yeah.
and critical thinking and critical thought. And that's what I learned when I went to my PhD program. There wasn't this emphasis on memorizing all these facts about things. We were taught how to think and how to
Wow.
think through complex questions. And so when you're an undergrad, you know, you like take tests where you memorize all the rules and then you do them.
Right.
And then you get to graduate school and they're like, here's a piece of data, design a set of experiments to figure out what it is. How would
Whoa.
you pursue this line of inquiry? And you're tested not on whether or not your hypothesis is correct, but on the elegance of your experiments and the elegance of your thoughts.
Wow.
And once I realized that, I was like, oh, I've been doing this all wrong. I have to learn how to think better.
That's incredible. I wish we all had a chance to learn how to think better.
I think that's the next I think that's got to be the next thing, especially in a world where it's getting easier and easier to create deceptive
Yeah,
bits of
because you can't you
information.
who no one knows what the truth is anymore, and it's so
Right.
easy to fake things and make them seem like they're truth. So at some point, we're all gonna have to be held accountable to discern our own truth.
Yeah. We call it media literacy and the ability to sort of observe a piece of whatever in the world, a phenomenon, and then sort of
Mm.
ask really, hopefully, good questions about it. How good are the questions you
See,
ask?
this goes
That's
back to how you ask questions. See?
yes. Yes.
It all comes back to the hard questions that you're really
Yeah.
good at.
Yeah, well, I mean, science taught me well, I guess, but I think it's like, you know, I think some of the best scientists in history and some of the best writers in history are these people who can go back to an almost totally naive state and ask from first principles, like really basic questions to sort of cast aside all our assumptions, all our ideas about what we think we know, and to ask questions as though they're totally naive. And that's why children ask really good questions, you know, like
Yeah.
they don't have all these assumptions. And I think that really good writing, like really good science, is just being able to ask almost naive questions about things that we all think we know, and to
Mm,
cut through assumption and to get at the heart of something that's true or real.
yeah. Wow. That's really beautifully said. This is making me think about your references to snow,
Mm,
which seem tied to Lionel, Charles, and Sophie, right? Like, am I seeing that right? That I feel like those stories all kind of have some intentional references to snow. And I mean, I have my ideas about sort of what it means and why, but I'd be curious to know where that thread started and
mm,
what you felt tied that those characters to the idea of snow.
mm. Well, so it starts like really basic for me. Like I was walking home, I think it was Thanksgiving, and everyone else had gone home for the break and I was still stuck in Madison at lab and it had snowed a lot and I was like trudging through the Madison snow and so I was like, well, these characters are also here during winter, so I'll write about the snow. But for me, like snow is one of those sort of deceptive things in that it seems really light and easy, but once it
Mm,
accumulates, it has this incredible density and
mm,
you got to really slog through it in order to get anywhere. And
yeah,
it piles up on you so quickly. And it also is so incredibly uniform. When you look out your window on a snowy morning, it's almost blinding. And so I think snow is important just for the fact of, it being Madison in the winter, but also the snow literalizes, I think, the difficulty of trying to discern anything in the world.
yeah,
Like it's hard to discern things, it's hard to move through the world. And you've got to also be so alert to all the hidden stuff because it may seem really dense and then you're walking and then suddenly it's soft and you go right through. And it's dangerous. It's
so
dangerous.
true. It's really interesting because I wasn't thinking about the accumulation of it as much as I was thinking about the impermanence of any,
Mm,
any given moment of snow, that that it felt, I don't know, something about like how our own feelings and our own emotions and our experiences of things are it's always passing as fast as a piece of snow could melt. Do you know what I mean? Like
yes.
it's like nothing you can't I mean, you even said in I'm gonna make sure I read it so I don't get it wrong, in Anne of Cleves, where we never are who we once were. And I was like, oh, what a beautifully efficient way of just telling the truth. It's like we can look back on ourselves a day ago and be like, oh, God, I can't believe I thought that way yesterday. And
Mm,
like that seems like so long ago, like that old me from yesterday. Um, but also just these, connections that your characters are sort of trying to make or attempting to make or observing in some way, and the sort of incorporeal, you
yeah,
know, sense of them.
totally. I mean, that's another one of the weird dualities of snow is that you're right. Like when you hold a snowflake in your hand, it totally melts.
Mm,
But if you get enough of it, it lasts until May, like
yeah,
very often in Madison, the snow would be hanging around in these pockets of shade as late as, May 15th or something like that. And yet there are sometimes when it snows and you try to hold on to it and it's poof,
yeah,
you melt it
yeah,
immediately.
yeah,
And I think, yeah, that's another one of the weird things about the self, which is that the minute you try to fixate on a part of yourself, the minute you train your focus on it, it's gone, like
yeah.
you totally destroy it. And it's almost like the only way you can be yourself is to kind of pay it no attention and just
Hmm,
to sort of move through life. It's very, and so it becomes permanent in its impermanence almost.
yeah. Wow. Wow, that's amazing. Um, do you have any like rituals to the way that you write? Do you have set things you like to do, or is it just sort of when it
Mm.
comes, or
Yeah, so I think I have this saying that when I'm in it, I'm in it. So when I'm in the middle of a project, I like to just get up first thing in the morning. Like I do it for like 2 or 3 hours and then I go for a walk and then I come back and I do it. I don't like
mm,
a lot of interruptions when I'm sort of in the flow of a thing. Um, and so I like that. And I think increasingly something that I've started doing is I find it really difficult to sort of work actively when I'm traveling. And so now what I do is I take a notebook with me and I take a
mm,
pen and I sort of write by longhand when I'm traveling and doing book stuff, and so that way I can kind of catch these, so I can sort of keep being in it even when I'm not at my desk.
Yeah.
And so that's a thing that's a habit I'm trying to cultivate more, is using the longhand to kind of stay in it a little bit, and to
Mm.
cultivate good habits of mind. But yeah, I think I mostly just wait until I get enough ideas, like a density of ideas, and then I'm just like, writing every day.
Wow.
And then I don't write for a week or two, and then I'm back in it. I'm writing every day.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
but just like, but it's so hard. I feel like the more successful I get as an author, the harder it is to do that, because there's always something, right? Like there's always,
Right.
go here, do that. Like I've had this long period of travel since like mid-September, where I was in Paris for like 2 weeks, and now I'm here, and I had to go to Maine, and then I was going to go to Cleveland, and next week I'm going to Michigan, and then I'm going to
Wow.
Seattle and Portland, and I won't have like a really solid break until like, the second week of November.
Wow.
And and so it's really hard to write, and it's hard to sort of be in it because you're having to constantly go to the airport.
Yeah.
And so that's really challenging. But my rituals are mostly just I come to my desk and I work. I do have like really like incredibly nitpicky things. So like I write in Microsoft Word, and
Mm.
I need the margins to be 2 inches. I need the font to be like Optima, and I need the line spacing to be 1.15 spacing. Um, and I mean, I've like gone as far as like setting the defaults on, I have like 3 computers, and like every computer has the same default document, because like that is where I need to just open it up. It's
Wow.
like
Was that
opening up.
trial and error? How did you know? How
Yes.
did you find
Yes.
that?
It was trial and error, and it was figuring out what works for me. And I also need the zoom to be like 200, so like it's the whole screen basically, and I need it to not look like a Word document. I need it to just look like a column of text. Just like a column of
Wow.
text. I don't want to know what the paragraphs look like in regular form. I just need it to look like a column of text,
Interesting.
so that I don't start thinking about the layout on the page too much, because that's for me that is distracting, and I get sort of hung up on if the paragraphs are all the same size or something, like, and so I'm just like, forget about it, just focus on the text, forget about
Yeah.
the, yeah. So those are the kind of like really silly mind rituals I have to do to sort of trick myself into
Yeah. We
getting.
all have it though. We're all trying to hack our own brains, you know? We're all trying to
Totally,
how do I
totally.
get around all this noise in my head and just get
Hmm.
myself to do what I want to do?
Yes. I have a friend who can't write on a computer that has the internet. She's got to like have like
Oh
she's
yeah.
like has one computer in her house where she's like just completely not severed it from any ability to be online.
I can
Um,
totally understand that. The amount of times I'm like, "Oh, I need to do whatever," and I pick up my phone and then I'm like, what was the thing I was gonna do? There's 18 other things I could do now, you know? It's so
totally.
distracting. Um, well, I know you have a fellowship at the New York Public Library right now, right? How
Yes.
is that going? What's that experience like? What are you writing? What's happening with all that?
So I got one of the Coleman Fellowships for 2022, and it's a really great fellowship at the New York Public Library. They give you an office, and they give you snacks, and they let you but more than anything, you have access to the full sort of research resources of the New York Public Library. It's at your full disposal,
Wow.
and it's incredible. And so I applied to work on a novel that's called A Group Show. It'll be the book that comes out after my next book.
Oh,
And
wow. You have a next book already. And
yes,
then this
yes, it comes out in May of 2023. It's called The Late Americans. It's a
wait, hang
novel.
on. Say, let's really cover this. Hang on.
Yes,
May 2023, and it's
yes,
called
The Late Americans.
Great. And that will be released like wide in May?
Yes, yep. It'll be in May. And then the book that comes after that is the one I'm researching now. It's called A Group Show, and it's about a contemporary art museum in Madison, Wisconsin. And like that novel is the novel I applied to work on there, but I've been deep down this research rabbit hole, like researching this particular like mid-century architecture and design publisher named Charles E. Whitney, and he had this really fascinating career, and he published some of the most important magazines with respect to design in American history. And
Wow.
then he just like disappeared. Like he died in 1976, and his publishing empire just totally vanished and dissolved. And so I'm researching him and his family, and I'm tracing all. I found all these like weird little strange things in their lives and stuff like that. And so I'm starting to think that in addition to writing this novel Group Show, I'm working on a little bit of a historical novel about a publishing family in New York in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and on to the 70s. And so
Cool.
that's like that'll be, way, way in the future. But that's the thing I'm having the most fun researching right now is just like all these cultural institutions of mid-century America, which is so fascinating.
Wow, that's wild. It's so cool to be able to like be at the library and have the
Hmm.
access to be able to just dig through all that.
Yeah, it's every nerd's greatest fantasy. Like, the New York Public Library opens at 10 a.m., but we get to go in early, and so I'll arrive at like 9:45, and there'll be like a line of people waiting outside the library, and I'll be like, "Excuse me," and you get to like cut in line. And it's like, wow, you get to cut in line in the library. But what I find most amazing is that there's a line of people waiting to get into the New York Public Library. How
Yeah,
cool is that? That's
pretty
so,
awesome.
yes. It always makes me
Yeah.
feel so good because it's like, wow, people really want to get into the library. And that's also such a great example of the importance of these institutions, right? Like wow, libraries really are these important like places of solace and respite where people come to work and learn and research things. It's like, I don't know, it makes me feel like, wow, this is so cool.
Yeah, and the New York Public Library has also done an incredible job of cultivating so many resources. I
Hmm.
mean, there's endless resources, it seems like. It's not just the research stuff. It's like every time I'm because the our book club is sort of partnered with the Young Lions over there, and so we talk to the girls who run that quite often. And every time something comes up, they're like, "Well, we have a resource for that. We have a resource for that." I'm like, "Oh my god, what doesn't the library do?" You know?
It has everything. It is so cool. Like I
Yeah.
sometimes I'm there and I'm like just like poking through the databases and I'll be like, "Oh, you have a database of like magazines from like the 1920s. Why?
Wow.
So random,
But
but
amazing.
but
Yeah.
amazing." Yes.
And one of the first times I took a tour there, they handed me Oscar Wilde's like handwritten draft of The Importance of Being Earnest, which was just one of the most impactful pieces of literature for me. It was the first time I think I was probably like, I don't know, 13-ish, 12 or 13-ish when I read it the first time. And it was the first time I understood that literature could be clever.
Mm.
That it wasn't just like something I had to do for school, but that it was something that could be like delightful and clever. And I had this really like heart reaction to it. And they didn't know that. And they hand me this like handwritten version of it. And I think there was a title that was crossed out and it said something like, it was like a trivial play for trivial people. And then it was crossed out and then it said the importance of being earnest.
Oh wow. Oh, that's so we so they took us through a tour of all the sort of collections over there when we started our fellowship, and they took us up to the Berg, which is where all the sort of Americana and
Oh,
British
wow.
literature of the 19th century is. And they had like Charles Dickens reading glasses. They had the stick Virginia Woolf took on her
Yep.
walk to sort of drown in the river. They
Yep.
had they had like Fielding's writing desk. I was like, oh my gosh, like
Yeah.
Charles Dickens reading classes. They let us look through them. I was like, oh my goodness.
They now have all that on display in the treasures exhibit.
Yes.
And so there's that stuff, and then I think they're about to have, or maybe already have, the big Virginia Woolf exhibit
Hmm.
in the treasures exhibit. It's so cool.
It's
It's just
so cool. They
I
had
could live
they
in
had
there.
radio. They had like the radio from W.H. Auden. They had like
Wow.
Kerouac's like weird like ephemera. I mean, it was just I was like, oh my God. They had like William Blake's like one of the original William Blake illustrated folios. And I was like, what?
So
What? Oh
wild.
my gosh, like newspapers from the 1910s.
I
they also have like these huge books that were made by like the insurance companies for like fire insurance in New York City. And so they like unfold them and you can see all these like maps of the city and how it changed.
Oh, wow.
It's so amazing. And as someone who didn't grow up going to the library but wanted to go to the library quite a lot,
Mm,
the fact that I get to go there every day and then I get to like poke around and find all this like really cool stuff. And the research, the archivists are so nice and they're like,
yeah.
please come see our maps, please come see this, come see
Yes.
that. It's like every nerd's greatest fantasy come true.
It's one of those things that kind of gives you faith and hopefulness. Do you know what I mean? Because
Yes.
it just feels like everyone's there because they love what they do and they love literature and they love, diving into the research of it all, and they also love sharing it with people, and I think it's very rare. There's just not a lot of places that you can go in the world anymore where you're there, it just surrounded by passion.
Yeah.
It's really very cool.
I mean, it's one of those beautiful things about democracy, I guess. It's like, wow, and all this belongs to all of us because we are
Yeah.
a nation. Wow, so beautiful.
Well, and that's the stuff we forget sometimes, it's like,
Hmm.
especially in a time where the world is so split and the country is so polarized. And, one of the other novels that we featured this year, which is called I Will Die in a Foreign Land by Kaylani Pickard, which won the Young Lions Award this year. She has a really beautiful stretch in the book about how the characters are talking about it, but it just felt so right now, which was saying that we forget that what we fight for when we fight for democracy is the right to disagree peacefully. And I
Mm,
was like, oh, we have forgotten that. Like, that's the point. That's the point of democracy, is that we don't all have to think the same, and that we don't all have to hope that everybody thinks the same, but we can disagree and still be at peace. That we can debate and we can, sometimes you might change sides because you were convinced by that debate, and I feel like we've just so lost that in media and in culture right now. And when you go somewhere like the library, it's like one of those rare occasions where you feel like everybody's differences are sort of put aside and you're able to just really enjoy something that it's such a gift to live in a country that would give a resource like that.
totally. Yeah, I was talking to some of my friends who are scholars, and they're like, yeah, to like get that kind of access in Paris or France at one of those museums, it's like such a
Mm,
long, arduous process, right? But at the New York Public Library, almost anyone can
hmm.
at least ask to see it, and there'll be, I'm
Yeah,
sure, administrative red tape, but it's not as, you know, as restricted as in other countries. And I'm like, wow, that's like one of the things that America perhaps is doing a little right. Probably could be better. Always could
sure.
be better, but it's nice. It feels like, ah, yeah, like we can have access to these things and they want us to have access to these things. Archivists are some of the most, like excited, brilliant, hardworking people I think at work in the culture today. And it's been
Yeah,
fun to sort of get to know more and more of them at the library.
that's really cool. I could literally talk to you all day, and I know I have to let you go, so I'm cutting us off. But my last question is just: is there any advice that you were ever given that you felt like was impactful in a way that you would share with other people?
Mm. I mean, I think the piece of advice that I come back to most often is advice from my professor of eukaryotic molecular biology, which is, form a hypothesis of the thing you feel to be the most true, and then try to disprove it with absolute ruthlessness.
Mm.
Take your most precious ideas and interrogate them with as much skepticism as you can possibly muster and see if you can change your own mind. And that is the thing that I come back to again and again in all my writing and all my thinking is here's something I that is my most precious idea. How can I disprove it?
That's amazing. I love that. What a wonderful place to end this interview. Thank you again so much for doing this. We are so lucky to have you. Um, yeah, it's just been an absolute pleasure talking with you, and hopefully I get to talk to you again because this has been awesome.
Yeah, this has been a blast. It was such a great way to spend this Saturday. Thanks so much.